On August 23, 1972, a 20-year-old woman in Bothell, Washington, made a small, ordinary decision. She borrowed her little sister's boots, waffle stomper boots, the kind that were everywhere that summer. Thick soles, lace-up fronts. Jana was 12, Jodie was 20. The boots were Jana's, but Jodie needed them for the ride, because today, for the first time, she wasn't driving to the stable. She was taking the bike, a white 10-speed, 6 miles northeast of her family's home on Winesap Road. She kept a horse named Saudi at a stable off Strummer Road, and she rode him regularly. Every other time, she drove. This afternoon, the sun was out, the roads were quiet, and she decided to pedal. She left the house around 5 o'clock. She never made it to the stable. Snohomish County, Washington in 1972 was not what it is today. The area around Mill Creek was rural, dirt roads, horse properties, wide stretches of open land with no houses in sight, just trees and fields and quiet. The kind of place where a young woman could ride a bicycle for miles and not pass another person. And on that afternoon, she didn't. Penny Creek Road cuts northeast through stretches of dense Pacific Northwest forest. Partway along her route, a dirt track branches off into the trees. Not a road, a track, the kind locals might know about. Hunters, kids looking for somewhere private, people with no good reason to be back there. That dirt track is where Jodie Lumis's ride ended. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, a young couple drove up that same track to do some target shooting. Tin cans in the woods. Nothing unusual for that part of Washington. What they found instead was a young woman lying on the ground. She was mostly undressed. She had been sexually assaulted, and above her right ear there was a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol. She was still breathing, barely, unresponsive. The couple didn't stop to think about the crime scene. They picked Jodie up, carried her to their car, and drove 15 minutes west to Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds. She was pronounced dead on arrival. Investigators worked the scene. Jodie had been forced off the road at gunpoint and taken deep into the trees. She was sexually assaulted. She was shot as she tried to dress herself. The gunshot wound killed her. Her white 10-speed was right there on the dirt track, exactly where it had been stopped. Her clothing was recovered. Everything was bagged, labeled, and transported to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office for storage, including the waffle stomper boots, Jana's boots. Calm deputies canvassed. They questioned local men. 2 drew attention. One was a ranch owner who had previously behaved inappropriately around Jodie. The other was a tenant on a nearby property who'd been chopping wood close to the dirt track that afternoon and couldn't clearly account for his time. Deputies questioned both, and several others. No physical evidence connected any of them to what happened in those woods. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no name that investigators could act on. By the end of 1972, the case had stalled. Snohomish County's newest homicide was already its most frustrating one. The evidence went into long-term storage. The file went onto a shelf. The detectives moved on, but the Lumis family didn't move on. They couldn't. Jana Lumis was 12 years old. The afternoon her sister borrowed her boots and didn't come home. 12 years old. She grew up watching her parents carry a grief that never softened. Jodie's bedroom was left the way it was for a long time after the murder. Jana said you could still smell the patchouli oil when you walked in. Jodie's leather purse was right where she'd set it down on the last day of her life. The family called the sheriff's office for updates, year after year. The answer was always the same, nothing new. Jana went from 12 to 20 to 30 to 40. She graduated. She got married. She became Jana Lumis Smith. She built a life, but she never put down the case. Both of Jodie's parents died without ever knowing who killed their daughter. They raised a girl, lost her on a summer afternoon, spent the rest of their lives waiting for an answer, and died with the same question they had carried since 1972. Jana became the family's voice after they were gone. She kept calling detectives. She showed up at press conferences when the sheriff's office made another push. She refused to let the file disappear into a drawer. She said the pain had become part of their surviving life. She said Jodie had her whole life ahead of her, and it was just taken away, and we live with that every day. In 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office pulled Jodie Lumis's file off the shelf. The case was 33 years old. It was the county's oldest unsolved homicide. Scharf went back through the original evidence. He re-interviewed people where he could find them, and he sent everything that might yield DNA to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for modern testing. 3 years later, in 2008, a lab technician found something on the outside of the left boot. Jana's boot, the one Jodie had borrowed on the last afternoon of her life. A stain, small, on the outside surface of the leather. It had been there since August 23, 1972, 36 years. The boot had been examined by investigators at multiple agencies across multiple decades. It had been handled, cataloged, moved between facilities, transferred from room to room. And in all that time, through all those examinations, not a single investigator had seen it. The technician spotted it under different lighting conditions, with modern equipment. It was semen. The lab extracted a partial DNA profile from the stain and submitted it to CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. If the man who left that sample had ever been convicted of a qualifying offense, the database would return a match. It returned nothing. The man who killed Jodie Lumis was not in CODIS. That didn't mean he had a clean record. It meant his offenses either predated mandatory DNA collection laws or fell outside the categories that required a sample. The partial profile sat in the database for the next 10 years, running automatically against every new entry as people were convicted and added to the system, year after year. No hit. Scharf kept the case open through all of it. He stayed in contact with Jana. He called her even when there was nothing to report. In July 2018, Scharf tried something different. He sent the DNA profile to a private forensic lab in Virginia called Parabon Nanolabs. They specialize in a technique called genetic genealogy. Instead of matching crime scene DNA against convicted offenders, genetic genealogy uploads the profile to public ancestry platforms, sites like GEDmatch, where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace their family history. If anyone in that database shares enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it means they are biologically related to whoever left it. From there, you build a family tree, and you narrow it down. Parabon brought in a genetic genealogist named Deb Stone, based in Oregon. Stone's job was to take the distant DNA matches from GEDmatch, second cousins, third cousins, people who had no idea they were connected to a 1972 murder case, and work backward through generations. She spent 57 hours on the project, combing through online family trees, court records, census documents, obituaries, marriage licenses, anything she could find in public databases. The branches of the tree eventually pointed to one family in the Edmonds area of Snohomish County, Washington. 5 miles from the crime scene, genealogy could narrow the family, but it couldn't tell investigators which member of that family left the DNA at the scene in 1972. They needed a direct sample to confirm. So, they watched. On August 28, 2018, law enforcement officers followed a man to the Tulip Casino north of Everett, Washington. They watched him walk in. They watched him buy a coffee. They watched him sit down at a machine, drink it, and throw the cup in a garbage can. After he walked away from the machine, investigators moved in. They took the cup out of the garbage, and they drove it straight to the crime lab. In September 2018, the lab confirmed it. The DNA extracted from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the semen on Jodie Lumis's left boot. The statistical probability of a coincidental match, 980 million to 1. After 46 years, after tens of thousands of investigative hours across dozens of investigators and multiple agencies, a discarded coffee cup at a casino had given them what nothing else could. His name was Terrence Miller. Everyone called him Terry. He was 77 years old. He had lived 5 miles from the crime scene for all 46 of those years. He had raised a family, run a small ceramic shop out of the garage of his home in Edmonds. To his neighbors, he was Terry, the retired heavy equipment operator, the ceramics guy, a quiet old man who had been there forever. Calm, his record told a different story. In 1968, 4 years before Jodie's murder, he had been cited for lewd conduct after exposing himself to a teenage girl. He was 18 when he married his first wife. She was 14. In the years after the murder, accusations followed him. A preteen in the mid-1970s, 2 sisters in 1990, a man with developmental disabilities in 1999, 5 known accusations spanning 3 decades. Not one of them led to a conviction after that first citation. His name never appeared anywhere in Jodie's case file, not once. He was a stranger. He was invisible to the investigation, and he stayed that way for 46 years. On April 11, 2019, Snohomish County deputies arrested Terrence Miller at his home in Edmonds. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jodie Lumis. Bail was set at $1 million. He posted it. He went home, to the same house, to the garage with the ceramic shop. Detective Jim Scharf, who had spent 14 years on the case by that point, called Miller what he was when the arrest was announced: a real predator. Calm, Miller pleaded not guilty. The trial was delayed by the pandemic and defense motions challenging the DNA evidence. Jury selection began in late October 2020 in Snohomish County Superior Court. The trial ran 2 weeks. Prosecutors walked the jury through the entire chain: the semen found on the boot in 1972, the partial DNA profile developed in 2008, the Parabon analysis and Deb Stone's 57 hours of genealogy work, the surveillance at the casino, the coffee cup, the WSP lab confirmation, 980 million to 1. The defense went after every link. They argued that 5 decades of evidence handling had introduced contamination that made the DNA results unreliable. They pointed out that deputies at the 1972 autopsy hadn't worn gloves. That evidence had been lost and unaccounted for across the decades. Under cross-examination, prosecution witnesses acknowledged that a crime lab analyst's own DNA had turned up on a reference sample during testing. They made real arguments, reasonable ones. And then Jana spoke. 48 years after her sister's murder, she stood in that courtroom, in front of the jury, in front of the man charged with killing Jodie, and she spoke. She told the court that for those of us who remain, all we have is the hope of justice and accountability for the hideous theft of Jodie's life. She said that in the 46-plus years since that day, the accused had celebrated birthdays and Christmases and every holiday in between. He had married, he had raised children, he had gone on living a full life, while her family lived with a hole that never closed. Closing arguments finished on Friday, November 6, 2020. The jury began deliberating that afternoon. Then they broke for the weekend. On Monday morning, November 9, 2020, Terrence Miller was found dead at his home in Edmonds, self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 78 years old. The Snohomish County medical examiner confirmed it as suicide. The jury didn't know. They had resumed deliberations that same Monday morning at the courthouse, working through the evidence and the defense's contamination arguments, with no idea that the defendant was already dead. That afternoon, they reached their verdict: serious guilty, first-degree murder. 12 people who had no knowledge that the defendant had taken his own life looked at the DNA evidence, looked at 50 years of evidence handling, at the defense's contamination arguments, at all of it, and decided the chain held. The semen on the boot was Miller's. The coffee cup confirmed it. He killed Jodie Lumis in those woods off Penny Creek Road in August of 1972, and the evidence he left on her little sister's boot is what proved it. 48 years later, Miller's defense team filed a motion to vacate the conviction. Their argument was that he had died before the verdict was read, that he had been denied his constitutional right to appeal, and the conviction should be thrown out. Judge David Kurtz held a hearing. He heard from both families. He heard from the attorneys. Then he ruled against the motion. It was not the right thing to do, the judge said, to erase what the jury had found. The conviction stands. Jana Loomis Smith was 12 years old when she lent her sister those waffle stomper boots on a sunny afternoon in August. She was 60 when the jury said guilty. Her parents were both gone by then. She heard the verdict without them. Detective Jim Scharf said he was glad the family got to hear it, that it was good for them. It was the only thing the system had left to give. Not a sentencing, not a prison term. The man who killed Jodie had already taken that from them too. But the jury said it, out loud, in a courtroom, on the record: guilty. Jodie Lumis was 20 years old. She lived with her parents, her fiancé, and her 12-year-old sister at 20 Winesap Road in unincorporated Snohomish County. She kept a horse named Saudi at a stable 6 miles from home. She rode regularly. She wore patchouli oil. She had a leather purse she set down one afternoon and never came back for. She was going to ride her bike. It was sunny. She borrowed her sister's boots. That's all she did.